When did making plans get this complicated? It's time to streamline with WhatsApp, the secure messaging app that brings the whole group together. Use polls to settle dinner plans. Send event invites and pin messages so no one forgets Mom's 60th. And never miss a meme or milestone. All protected with end-to-end encryption. It's time for WhatsApp. Message privately with everyone. Learn more at whatsapp.com.
This episode is brought to you by Jack Daniels. Jack Daniels and music are made for each other. They share a rhythm in the craft of making something timeless, while being a part of legendary nights. From backyard jams to sold-out arenas, there's a song in every toast. Please drink responsibly. Responsibility.org. Jack Daniels and Old No. 7 are registered trademarks. Tennessee whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume. Jack Daniel Distillery, Lynchburg, Tennessee.
At Sierra, discover top workout gear at incredible prices, which might lead to another discovery. Your headphones haven't been connected this whole time. Awkward. Discover top brands at unexpectedly low prices. Sierra, let's get moving.
Welcome back to the Paddock and the Pavilion and to part 2 of Longchamp Legends. I'm your host, Stephen Wallis, and once again I'm joined by author and former diplomat, Oli Hein. In this episode, Oli focuses on the great French winners of the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe, who feature in his book Punch a Hole in the Wind. He also reveals who he considers to be the greatest of them all. Thanks for joining me again, Oli. And in this part, we're going to talk about, part 2, we're going to talk about 5 French winners of the Arc de Triomphe. And we're going to begin with Brantôme, who won in 1934. What can you tell me about him?
Great to be here again, Stephen. Thank you. And yes, we're going to concentrate on some of the great French winners, some of whom I think will be very familiar to your listeners, but some may not be. Brantôme, as you say, was early 30s champion. He was another one that I would sort of bracket. Says if you don't know much about him, worth looking in, because not much online in terms of videos to find. There may be some loitering around somewhere, but definitely worth exploring. I think my headline say with him would be, if it wasn't for just one moment of madness that he had as a 4-year-old, then you would remember him even more. But we're gonna come into that in a minute. Basically, he completed, first of all, that the rare sort of French juvenile Triple Crown. They're big 3 races for the 2-year-olds, the Morning de Robert Papin, the Grand Critérium, which is a big deal and quite difficult to do. So he was already a great 2-year-old. He then, as a 3-year-old, wins a lot of the big early races. He had an absolutely killer turn of foot, despite being tiny. He looks like, he was only officially 15-1, which was the same as Northern Dancer. Really quite, he's almost a pony. He then sort of sadly had a bout of coughing over the time of the middle of the summer. So then he had to come back in his 3-year-old season, where they took a chance with him just as he was getting better again in the Prix Royal Oak, the French St. Leger, manages to sort of sneak in a victory there, but then gets ready for the Arc. And it was, again, one of the best lineups at the time. It was only, 14 years old, the Arc at the time, but it was already attracting a lot of the best horses, including Ascot Gold Cup winners and Derby winners and lots of others. And although he was a horse who had an amazing turn of foot, it was quite a heavy ground that day, and he sweated a lot, and it didn't look good. But he was ridden by Charles Bouillon, who I mentioned earlier on, who was the horse who came second in that race that Faris won. And again, everybody said when he pressed that button, the speed of the acceleration was, I think, actually it was Le Petit Parisien, which was one of the sort of newspapers at the time sort of covering it. They said his acceleration would never be forgotten by those who saw it. And it was talked about a lot in the Paris Triomphe, I think, afterwards. And the French were already calling him at the time the sort of cheval du siècle, which I think I don't need to translate, the horse of the century. Lots of horses, of course, are put forward as being that. But this horse was so popular and being so good that they even made like a documentary about him. So not that long afterwards, they sort of edited together a sort of brief short film about his life, and it was called Brantôme, Invincible Horse. And so fans were flocking to the cinema to go and see him, because that's what sort of how impactful he'd been. So there's his victory in 1934, and he's really already considered as one of the greats. And everybody thought, oh, there was a very good horse at the time as well, who's also in the book, called Windsor Lad, and they thought, oh, these two horses, they will finally meet in the Ascot Gold Cup the following year. You know, it's going to be great. Actually, that didn't happen because firstly, Windsor Lad was withdrawn, but then, and remember, and this was when Brantôme was 4. He just won the Prix du Cadran, the French Gold Cup, by 15 lengths. He was still looking amazing. But then something happened. Basically, he was quite highly strung, or was becoming more and more so. And he was on his way to Chantilly, to the racecourse, to run in the Prix du Dangu, a sort of warm-up race, when he escaped his groom. And then he ended up basically charging down the main road in Chantilly for an hour, just galloping and just going absolutely mad, running in circles, running up and down. Nobody could catch him. He was smashing his way up and down the avenue. He lost 3 shoes, got a huge cut on his leg. And of course, when they caught him, he was, exhausted, terrified, missed his training. He had to have a tetanus jab afterwards. Basically, it was all looking terrible. But then his owner, very sportingly said, who was one of the Rothschild family, basically said, oh, let's run in the Gold Cup. It's what everybody wants. And sure enough, he lost, and he never lost before. And apparently there were members of the French public were literally calling up their friends and family in England, so saying, I'm sorry, I've just read that Brantôme lost. Is that true? That's how unlikely it was, as far as they were concerned, that he'd lost. But he just was not quite the same horse again, because then when he ran in the Arc for the second time, age 4, he came 4th, and genuinely, if he hadn't have had that incident beforehand, he could have been another double winner quite easily, we think, because he was generally considered that good. And even, I think another quote, because I like sort of quoting the people of the time. So it was the Bloodstock Breeders Review wrote at the time, and they were always pretty sober in their write-ups usually. They wrote, as success followed success, the praises in his honour became louder and louder, and he was generally pronounced a crack and the horse of the century. So these are quite brave words for something that normally sort of says, yes, he's a good horse. So he was one of the true greats of the 30s, without a shadow of a doubt.
We're moving on to the 1950s now, 1951 and 1952, a dual winner, Tantiem, which was a vintage year, I think, in 1951 for 3-year-olds.
It was. Tantiem won that race as a 3-year-old, where he led home 6 3-year-olds, which showed that A, they were really, really hot that year, and B, he was easily the best of them. There's a few things to point out about Tantiem, which I think which are really pertinent to the Arc as well. So firstly, I think I mentioned this earlier on with Lester Piggott riding very confidently on Alleged. Well, Jacques de Jasper, who was the first jockey to win 4 Arcs, he did something, and this was in I think it was the second of Tantiem's victories. So about a week before the race, he went round to Maxim's, which is one of the great Paris restaurants, and he booked a table for 12 specifically. And they said, is there a special event? And they said, yes, it's to celebrate my forthcoming victory in the Arc de Triomphe. Now that's confidence. And he was a very confident and very good rider. Of course, he needed the right mount, and Tantiem was definitely the right mount. Just imagine a jockey doing that these days. So he'd had a very successful career. He only lost 2 or 3 times, and each time that he lost, it was because of very strange circumstances. One, he'd basically not slept coming over to England on a terrible flight and got airsick, so he didn't feel well. There was another one, which was when he in inverted commas lost the Prix du Jockey Club when he was 3, but he may not have lost it. The reason being, this was before the days of or they hadn't yet introduced the photo finish at Chantilly. And so most people thought that as he went, flashed past with Scratch, who was Marcel Boussac's big horse at the time, and they came past the post together. And most people thought Tantiem had just won, but there was no photo. And so it all depended on the judge. And the judge, who was called Le Comte de Caroulet at the time, he basically said, his instinct was always said, it's always the horse that is on the far side is usually the one who's won. And that was Scratch. It wasn't Tantiem. And everybody said, but no, the other horse won. So François Maté, who was the trainer of Tantiem, never forgave him that. And so there was a bit of and Roger Poincelet, who was the jockey of Tantième that day, he basically went to scratch his jockey, Ray Johnson, who was an Aussie. He said, basically, you knew that you'd lost, but you went ahead and pretended you won anyway, and then gave him a massive right hook when he was weighing out on the scales and was fined 25,000 francs for his troubles. So things always seem to follow Tantième quite interestingly, but he won so many Grade 1s, and he was a vintage horse that year. And then when he came back for his second year, remember, only 3 horses had won 2 arcs at the time. The attendance was 100,000, which was, again, I mean, it's just an incredible number of people going. But there was also 400 million francs were being put on the Paris Mutuel that day, which was an awful lot. So he became the last French bred horse to be a double arc winner in the 20th century, if that makes sense. But I think what's really important with Tantième, though, is that he became the flag bearer for this new era of the arc, because, as I mentioned before, the arc was it was definitely growing very quickly already, but it was only in 1949 that Longchamp teamed up with the National Lottery in France, the Loterie Nationale, and basically they said, right, the same way that our lottery here sort of sponsors big causes too, they basically injected 25 million francs into the purse. And that turned it from being a well-respected middle-distance race to, which it definitely was, to basically being the richest middle-distance weight-for-age race in Europe and very possibly the world. So that's what really sort of kicked it off and going from strength to strength to give it its position as one of the most prestigious races in the world. But what it needed at the time, when that sort of first started, was a flag bearer and a hero to sort of act as the centerpiece for that race, and Tantième rose to that magnificently by winning it twice.
So Tantième was the horse that basically meant the Arc overtook the Grand Prix de Paris.
Not just the Grand Prix Paris, but I think certainly that, but also I think a lot of other races. And we can talk, if we want to afterwards about, why I think it's a bigger and a greater race than some of the classics for various reasons, although it may be a little bit controversial. But yes, I think that Tantième really was an important part of that history to make that happen.
Experience a membership that backs your business journey with American Express Business Platinum. Earn 5 times membership rewards points on flights and prepaid hotels booked on AmexTravel.com. Plus, enjoy a welcome offer of 200,000 points after you spend $20,000 on purchases on the card within your first 3 months of membership. American Express Business Platinum. There's nothing like it. Terms apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/business-platinum.
I'm Scott Hansen, host of NFL Red Zone. Lowe's knows Sundays hit different when you earn them. We've got you covered with outdoor power equipment from Cobalt and everything you need to weatherproof your deck with Trex decking. Plus, with lawn care from Scott's and, of course, Pit Boss grills and accessories, you can get a home field advantage all season long. So get to Lowe's, get it done, and earn your Sunday. Lowe's, official partner of the NFL.
This episode is presented by State Farm. Having insurance isn't the same as having State Farm. It's like expecting the leadership of a team captain on the football field, but getting a sea captain. You wouldn't settle for just anything for your team. Shouldn't it be the same for your insurance? So don't settle for just any insurance when you can go with a leader. State Farm. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
Another horse who certainly is part of the history is Seabird, or as your book says, Seabird the Second.
Yes. So I try to clear this up in the book because I know lots of people sort of get a bit confused. How many Seabirds were there? There was only one. Sometimes he was called Seabird, hyphenated. Sometimes Seabird the Second. So that's depending on whether he was running in England or in France, basically. And for some quite obscure precedent reasons about whether there'd been a horse called Seabird in the past who'd run by that, it doesn't really matter. The bottom line is he was almost mythical in my mind, Seabird. But there's we'll come to his great race, his ultimate great race in a minute. But quite a sad fact early on was that not only did he come from quite unprepossessing background, let's say, with his breeding, because Dan Cupid, his sire, had finished second in the French Derby, but he wasn't great. But more sadly, his mother, his mare, Cicalade, so she had terrible time whenever she foaled. And so Seabird she'd had foals before him and after him, and basically she was in such pain that the owner of Seabird and of her was Jean Tiernic, who was a textiles magnate. Basically, he thought it's quite sad. He basically didn't think he had a choice. He said, "I want to get her out of her misery," so he sold her. He sold her to the local butcher for 1,000 francs before Seabird was even ran. So, yeah, a little bit of a sad start, but even so. So he was trained by Etienne Paulet near Chantilly, and basically, as a 2-year-old, he was amazing. The only race he lost by a head was because his jockey at the time just left far too much. I mean, just an unbelievable amount of ground to make up, which he very nearly did. So he lost to a stablemate called Grey Dawn. But as a 3-year-old, I mean, he was astonishing. So he had his warm-up races in the Prix Greffule and then the Prix Lupin, winning by 6 lengths. But then he decided to bring him over to Epsom for the Derby. And there was a phrase that people used that day and basically said that it was true. So you had to see it to believe it. And so this was the days, I think it's before starting stall. So he's almost side on when the first starts. So he loses a few lengths at the beginning, but no big deal. He's ridden by then by the very phlegmatic Aussie called Pat Glennon for the rest of his career. And basically Etienne Paulet was sort of so confident that he would win. He told Glennon beforehand, said, "Look, there's just after the quite soon after the finishing line in Epsom, there's a sort of road that sort of cuts across the course, and it's covered in a bit of dirt. But yeah, I don't want him to hurt his legs on that. So try and not to be running at full tilt before then when you win." And so Seabird could have won that race by 8 lengths very easily. Could have won the Derby easily by 8 lengths. But in fact, he's only winning by 2 because Glennon is almost literally pulling him up for the last 150 yards. It's just frighteningly easy. And every horse behind him, Meadow Court in second, wins the Irish Derby and the King George. I Say wins the Coronation Cup afterwards. Silly Season wins the St. James Palace Stake at Royal Ascot. I mean, they're all miles behind him. And, you know, Lester Pigot's convinced at that stage that Seabird's the best horse he's ever seen. Then it comes to the Arc. So he wins the Grand Prix de Saint-Cloud after that, easily, of course. Then it comes to the Arc. And I mentioned Dancing Brave's victory and Rebo's victory earlier on because those years had, you know, incredible lineups. And I think the 1965 one that Seabird won could have been the greatest lineup and certainly one of the best 3 of all time. So he had Diatom, who was, I'll talk about him, he sort of won loads of big races in France and then in America. You had the unbeaten Prix du Jockey Club winner, Reliance. You had Meadow Court, I just mentioned. You had the US champion, Tom Rolfe. I think he'd won the Preakness Stakes. You had the greatest horse to ever come out of the Soviet Union, Anilin. Right? These are amazing 20-strong international field. And even though Seabird's sort of sweating quite a bit, they enter the straight. Seabird and Reliance sort of pull away from the others. And then Glennon said afterwards, well, I thought it was pointless to wait any longer. And then he just lets him go. And although he sort of veers bizarrely into the middle of the track, it's really quite odd if you watch it again now. He literally, you know, Lawson's wide, but he runs almost sideways for the last furlong, but he's still 6 lengths clear. And he spread eagles this amazing field, all of whom are running, you know, to the best their standards. And time form, I think, gave him the highest sort of rating of any horse they had given until Frankel. And that was his last race. Every, you know, horse he beat behind there immediately goes and wins a grade 1 straight afterwards, just to sort of show how good it was. There was a little caveat, a coda, if you will, to that. So my dad was at the race that day. My dad really struck lucky. I tell you why. The 3 races I remember him telling me going to the Arc were Seabird in 65, Nijinsky and Sassafras in 70, and Dancing Brave in 86. So he knew how to pick them. But he was a lucky man. So but he always remembered telling me that day. He was just a doctor living in Paris at the time, and he was watching Seabird just basically destroy this field in the Arc. And he's beside an old French racegoer beside him who is just looking bemused and keeps shouting, "Mais arrêtez-le, arrêtez-le," sort of stop him, somebody stop him. And then he wins, and then my dad turns around and said, why did you want Seabird to be stopped? And, did you bet on another horse or something? And the French racegoer basically said, who may not have been a sort of regular racegoer, it has to be said, basically said, because if they don't catch him, he'll take off. I mean, that is how amazingly fast he was going. And, obviously a very aptly named horse in that sense, being called Seabird. But I think truly one of the great performances in the Arc, without a shadow of the doubt, from one of the most sublime horses.
Your dad certainly lived in the right place for the Arc, didn't he?
He did, yeah. He was resident at the American Hospital in Neuilly, which is just outside Paris. So I sometimes wonder whether he chose to go there specifically just to watch all the French racing. So in which case he chose the right time and the right place, yeah.
Seabird amazingly sired a horse we're going to talk about next in Ali France, and also a champion hurdle winner in Seabird.
Exactly. Can't be many others, because people sort of mock Seabird for not being a great stallion. And I say, no, if you can get Ali France and Sea Pigeon, that's pretty good, frankly. That's some protein versatility right there. Yeah, Ali France so her big year was 74, but actually she's a lot more than that. And she was brilliant. Some people said she was ugly. Some people said she was pretty. It doesn't really matter. But she was the absolute apple of the eye of Yves Saint-Martin, who was 15 times French champion jockey. And it's interesting that the very first time she sort of ran on the gallops as a 2-year-old, he basically just hopped off, sort of looked at the trainer and said, "Yeah, that's money well invested," because she'd cost $200,000, which was a lot for a filly at the time. Great 2-year-old. Then goes as a 3-year-old. But one of the things, and I think this is what you were alluding to earlier, Stephen, which was she was fractious. A bit like we mentioned Rebo, who was fractious, and he at least had a stablemate who was very very chilled and kept him calm. Well, Ali France didn't have that. So her first trainer was on Albert Klimcha, basically said she needs company. So he thought, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick a rabbit in her stall. Now, it's the right thought in terms of, having an animal there. But, rabbits are quite a bit smaller than horses. And when she had a tetchy, this happened 3 times on each occasion. Let's just say when they got up in the morning, the rabbit was not in a good state. They then thought, okay, rabbit's too small. Let's get her a sheep. So they got her a sheep called Bastien, or sometimes called Steve for some reason, but usually called Bastien. And Bastien, her big fluffy sheep, her mouton, would sleep in her stable and travel in her horse box to every race just to keep her calm, because some fillies are just a little bit fractious. So after she'd won the French Guineas, the French Oaks, the Vermeil in her warm-up, she was favourite for the 73 Arc. And in fact, I think she's the only horse, who has started favourite for 3 Arcs. So this was her 3-year-old season. And I think she came second. And she came second behind Rheingold, who ran, frankly, a bit of an outlier. He was pretty unpredictable. He's very, very good on his day, obviously. But that was his day. He was, he was truly brilliant that day. Yves Saint-Martin sort of was saying at the same time that throughout her 4-year-old season in particular, as I said, riding Ali France generates a unique sensation, because when she accelerates, and when you watch her, she accelerates. She lowers herself by 30 centimeters as though she's streamlining herself to the turf. And you could almost see that in her races. I mean, she was just like a little bullet sort of going through. So she then has her amazing 4-year-old season afterwards. She moves stable to Angel Pena, an Argentinian trainer, and she wins the Gannet by length. She wins the Spar, the Prix d'Harcourt. She then wins the Prix Foix as her warm-up race. She's the big favourite. But that day, the Arc wasn't just about her. It was about Yves Saint-Martin as well, because she was the absolute apple of his eye. He'd never ridden a better horse, really. But then a week before, he fractures his foot and his hip in a fall. So the doctor says, sorry, 3 weeks in bed, which is normally what a jockey should do. But there was 2 things stopping him doing that. The first was that this was the Arc. This was his filly, and he really, really wanted to ride her. The second is that although he was friends with Esther Piggott, they had huge mutual respect. They were also rivals. And Piggott had once again, he'd seen that Yves Saint-Martin had been injured. And so he he basically went to her owner, Daniel Wildenstein, who he knew very well, and basically just started circling him for the whole week, sort of saying, I think I should be riding Allez France. I think you need to give that ride to me, not to Yves. He's ill. Give it to me. But Yves Saint Martin sort of had none of it. So basically pumped himself full of painkillers until 20 minutes before the race, raced with a broken foot, and then trusted that she wouldn't need to be hard ridden. In the end, he's in the lead. She explodes to the lead. Then she's rapidly caught up by another filly called Comtesse de Loire. But Yves Saint Martin is so exhausted and through the pain barrier, he always said, I'm never going to whip her because I know she's trying as hard as she can already. But the fact is, he couldn't have if he'd wanted to because he was absolutely shattered. But he wins by like a head, a very rapidly diminishing head. And then he sort of comes back into the winner's enclosure, gulps 2 glasses of champagne and collapses. So it was a pretty impressive performance by him. But again, Timeform, I think, gave her a rating that year, in 74, that I think is the highest ever achieved by a European filly since the war, which is pretty impressive. In her 5-year-old season, she wasn't as happy. She came 5th in Star Appeal's 1975 race. But I think she'd proved enough already over not just the Arc, but other races as well, that she was pretty special. And yeah, she had special breeding and she lived up to it.
Thanks, Ollie. Our final horse, another temperamental horse. You often hear this mentioned when you ever hear parade ring where they say this horse is out of Mount Montjour, and you immediately think, oh, right, okay.
This could be fun, yeah.
Yeah, a dual Derby winner, Irish and French, trained by an Englishman, and won the Arc in 1999.
He did. Mongeau's nickname given to him by his English trainer who trained in France, John Hammond, was the eccentric genius. And nobody could have put it better. He had his quirks, did Mongeau, like a lot of them. He was an odd fish. But when he was good, he was very, very good. Yeah, he absolutely cruised to the French Derby, and then the Irish Derby. He was extraordinarily good. And I think I'm trying to remember in the Irish Derby, it was quite weird because he started twisting his head to the side. He was ridden by Cash Rasmussen in those days. But he won it by 5 lengths in a really good field. And the Irish Times afterwards was just in absolute awe of him, thinking this was one of the best we'd ever seen. And that's when they said, yeah, but he did have his off days in the smaller races where he, the Prix Lupin he'd messed up, and then the Prix Niel, his warm up for the Arc, he just won by a head because he was just being quirky. But then when the Arc itself came, having a horse with a massive turn of foot, which obviously is a bit of a pattern here, it was a very heavy one, even by Arc standards, for the ground. And so we really thought, oh, that's gonna completely blunt his speed. And again, it was a fantastic field. But the hero that day, in many ways, wasn't just Mongeau, it was the jockey Masayoshi Ebina from Japan, because he was on top of El Condor Pasa, who was the best Japanese horse until then. And he just basically burgled this lead that nobody else could get anywhere near until they turned into the home straight. And he's 6 lengths clear, and he's not slowing down. And only one horse could get near him, which was Mick Kinnan was riding him by then. And he basically asked Mongeau in the last 2 furlongs in the mud to make up sort of 5 or 6 lengths on a horse who's not slowing down. And he did it. And it's really impressive. Sometimes it's easier to be more impressed by horses running on the really fast ground to make them look fast. But to make that much ground in ground that wasn't necessarily to his liking in that amount of space was incredible. Really impressive, and it absolutely broke Japanese hearts. Probably still the closest they've been, I think. But yeah, you've just mentioned, we can't then not mention what happened to Mongeau the following year at the King George, which is the only time he ran in England, I think. But this is, you mentioned the parade ring. So basically, to those who don't know, and this is quite bizarre, and it's again worth watching, Mongeau's not getting fractious, but he's refusing to go into the paddock before the King George the following year. And the thing is, he was basically playing games, and he was trying to make his connections guess what it was that he wanted to happen. And they were all losing their mind because everybody was saying, every other horse, they're meant to be in the paddock ages ago, and he wasn't there. And they couldn't get him in. And it was only then that John Hammond said, hang on, he really has a thing for my head lad, who was called Didier Follop. And what he realized that what Mongeau wanted was for Didier Follop, and only him, to ride him into the parade ring. He didn't want to have nobody on there. He didn't want somebody on there. He specifically wanted him, and he wasn't. That's how odd a horse he was. Like all the head lads, Didier Follop is not dressed as a jockey. He's in his tie, his suit, his brogues, everything. So he then jumps onto Mongeau's back and then has to go rowing around in his full suit, going around the winner's enclosure, just to keep the horse calm. Fortunately, then Mongeau then produces, the most impressive display in the King George you have ever seen. So the eccentric genius had the last laugh that day. He ran again, in the Arc the following year, and his heart wasn't in it by then. I think he finished fourth, but he'd sort of, his eyes were on other things maybe by then, and of course he became a fantastic stallion afterwards. But yeah, he was a quirky one, but on his day, absolutely brilliant.
That completes our 14 horses from your book.
Wow,
that have either won the Arc or had a near miss. Although we're creating a near miss a little bit with Faris.
Yes, yeah.
I know you said you didn't want to, but who, in your opinion, was or is the best of those?
How one is, no matter how much I caveat this, it's not enough, Stephen. So, I mean, I'm breaking my rules here because I still believe you can't compare across generations. Not just because circumstances have changed, but the thoroughbreds changed as well. But you are forcing my hand. So with a metaphorical gun to my head, my answer is really quite boring. It's Rebo and Seabird in a dead heat. Now you're probably saying, why them? Hard to say, isn't it? It's that ineffable magic they had about both of them, which is just hard to quantify. I know Timeform tries to quantify them, and other industrial classifications try to do the same. But now of course, all you do is you open this up to debate, and people will say, "Oh, you have your mind. Surely it was him or it was her." And of course, that's not the right answer. There is no right answer. But to me, there's something supernatural about those two, which has stuck in me. So yeah, Rebo and Seabird, dead heat. What's yours?
I wouldn't expect any more from a diplomat.
Well, exactly. I have to sort of make sure that everybody gets their time in the limelight, if you will. But trying to caveat as much as I can. But Stephen, what is yours? I want to know.
Oh, that's a good. You're not supposed to ask the interviewer a question.
Well, I know, but this is.
Now I'm scanning around trying to think.
Well, I tell you what, you have a think about that. Whilst I just have so. You asked me earlier about sort of why is the Arc such a great race. And I think I tried to explain earlier on, about the history of it, but also there's something else, which is, how much I love it personally. And for me, it's not just that it's, the richest European flat race. I think it's the greatest European flat race. And the traditionalists, of course, especially if you're British, they think that's a sacrilegious thing to say. If you're a Brit, you're obliged to say it's the Epsom Derby. That's all there is to it. And you should know your place, young man. But I politely disagree, and I think that's for a few reasons. So, firstly, this is a championship race that tests horses of all ages, not just precocious 3-year-olds, and it collects all the best from the middle distance, from the whole season. But just before it's too late, I wouldn't want it to have it at the end of October. I think that's probably too late. It's as late as you could have it, but it feels like an end of year championship because whisper it, but the first week of June is actually still quite early when the derbies run, and it tends, quite often not to be a test of who the best 3-year-old is. It's a test of who's the best 3-year-old in early June who can handle the utter weirdness of Epsom's contours. And that's not quite the same as the best 3-year-old, is it? And many, many great horses have won the derby, there's no doubt. Many we know we've talked about, should have won it but didn't. But then a lot of not so great horses have won it too. You could say about the Arc too, it has to be said. So I think Longchamp's just a bit of a fairer race course than Epsom. Most race courses are. You've also got the advantage of, with the Arc, that you spoke to Aidan O'Brien earlier this year, and the Derby, it seems that sort of guaranteed for Aidan O'Brien to win it almost. He seems to have his name on the Derby Trophy most years, which is, must be quite deflating for everybody else because of his, his genius in being able to provide it and have all the sort of best horses and best bred horses before it. So there feels a little bit more open with the Arc, that he doesn't necessarily win it, if you will. And yeah, the Arc's over 100 years old now. It's not 240 something like the Derby, but it's got plenty of heritage. So certainly for me, and it's a very personal thing, alongside the Grand National for very different reasons, it's the race I look forward to most each year.
And how many times have you been to Longchamp for the Arc yourself? You talked about your dad picking three of the best ever Arcs.
That's right. Lucky man. I have not struck so lucky, but in answer to your question, I have not been nearly enough. It's a mere twice, unfortunately. So first time was 1994. Can you guess who that was? Can you remember?
No, you're testing me now.
Not a memorable one. No, exactly. So it was Carnegie. He won. And I was super happy because I was a student at the time, and I decided to nip over and I looked at all the 10-year trends of who was going to win, and I bet on Carnegie, and it paid for a pair of shoes, which is good because my last ones are running out. I only had one pair of shoes then. Then I went again 3 years ago in 2022 when I saw Alpinista get home. So there had been horrible rainstorms all that day. So it was really quite squelchy underfoot. It was one of those, it was very sunny. We were all drinking outside, and then suddenly it was a horrendous cold rainstorm. Went and then it got sunny, and then it was a rainstorm. It was not great. I would argue, so like I've just said, I've just said the ones my dad went to were just phenomenal lineups. The two I went to were not the greatest, most vintage renewals, but it was great being there all the same. So, I mean, I can't go this year, but yeah, I always look at the beginning of each year and say, can I make it for October this year? And hopefully I will go again soon. It
must have been wonderful though to see Sir Mark win the Arc.
Yes, that was, it's quite surreal to be honest, because I never pictured him winning the Arc, which sounds like a really weird thing to say, but if your horse is good enough, he's certainly good enough. But yeah, it was a very positive atmosphere that day. Everybody was very happy for him. It was great.
The Japanese certainly want to win this race, though, don't they?
It's an obsession, and it's an obsession which is well deserved. And I think, but it's great because it's done in such a fantastically sporting way. And I think the Europeans really appreciate just how much emphasis that the Japanese put on the Arc, but just the efforts that they will put into it, and what good sporting losers they are when they don't win it. But we really the French, the British, the Irish, we will all be ecstatic when the Japanese finally do win. And like I said, we don't know which year it's going to be. The only thing I would say is that most of the Japanese horses, from my slightly ignorant position, tend to be much better on firmer ground because they run a lot more on firmer ground. And of course, good to soft to soft itself tends to be sometimes heavy, the ground in beginning of October in Paris. So you have to hope that all the stars align whereby you get a good ground with a good horse and not the strongest field, and then hopefully they'll have luck in running and win quite soon. But it would be great.
I've been giving some thought to your question. I must give you an answer. Not necessarily the best horse to win the Arc, but I think it's always when a race you remember most, and I think I'm going to go for Dancing Brave in 1986. It's
iconic, and you can't argue with that as one's, if you'd have said a sort of totally forgettable one, of course I'd have said what, but yeah, Dancing Brave in 86, I think, in fact, if you could put that one alongside the Seabird one in particular that I mentioned in 65, and if you basically took an average rating of all the horses who ran in those years and just sort of averaged out the ratings of those horses, I think you would get those two would be the strongest international fields ever assembled for a championship race since the war. I mean, that's an assertion. I haven't done all the details behind that, but I'd be surprised. I'd be interested to know what the answer to that is, but I'd be surprised if anything was higher than those. So, good call.
Now, we've been talking a lot about your book, Punch a Hole in the Wind. Where can people still get this book, which was originally published in 2022?
It was, and it's a sort of companion piece, like I mentioned, to Immortals, which we talked about earlier this year. It's available online in most large bookshops. I saw it in my local Waterstones recently, actually. And it's, the chances are, if you're a fan of the Arc and you're a fan of high quality racing and horses generally, then Punch a Hole in the Wind is for you. It'll unearth some of those little known factoids that I've been sort of mentioning now, which my digging sort of brought up. But it contains lots of your golden oldies, but also, like Faris that I mentioned earlier, some of the greats from the past that you may have forgotten, or ones that have absolutely fascinating stories to tell. And maybe I can leave you with a couple of tantalizing things in that book to make you may want to find out more. So, one of the horses I mentioned in there, not ARC related, was an Aussie great who had the biggest stride ever measured. And no, it wasn't Farlap, although he's in the book as well. There's another horse who was an unbeaten champion. He was so chilled that he used to literally lean against the stable door and cross his legs like a human and spend most of his training years sleeping, but he was still an unbeaten Triple Crown champion. And then, on a much sadder note, there was one incredible pioneering great who I'd love to talk about some other time, who probably had an absolutely tragic end, we found out by some digging, by ending up as a meal for hungry soldiers on the vast crowded beaches of Dunkirk in the build-up to the evacuation in 1940. One of the great horses. And you're thinking, wow, really? Yes. So if you want to find out more about those and some others from the past, then yeah, Punch a Hole in the Wind is for you.
Well, thank you very much for those interesting facts, Ollie. Enjoy this year's Arc de Triomphe, presumably via the television.
It will be via the television. I don't intend to place any bets on this year because I'm terrible at that anyway. I just want to enjoy it for its pure value. I hope you enjoy it too. And yes, it would be good to exchange notes afterwards to see who, hopefully we will be celebrating a Japanese victor, but we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, that's on Sunday, the 4th of October. Thank you once again for appearing in 2 parts of this special podcast about the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe.
Not at all, Stephen. It's been an absolute pleasure. Many thanks.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Doug. Here we have the Limu Emu in its natural habitat, helping people customize their car insurance and save hundreds with Liberty Mutual. Fascinating. It's accompanied by his natural ally, Doug.
Limu, is that guy with the binoculars watching us?
Cut the camera. They see us.
Only pay for what you need at libertymutual.com.
Liberty, 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 liberty.
Savings vary. Underwritten by Liberty Mutual Insurance Company and affiliates. Excludes Massachusetts.